Hi, everyone. I just wanted to come out with a shorter teaching on Purim tomorrow night. March the 13th begins Purim. I know some people don't celebrate, but I just wanted to go through a little bit of information about the holiday, not exactly how it's celebrated, but more of just some biblical information. So this is basically about Purim and the book of Esther. So in Israel and around the world, many a brother Yehuda will celebrate Purim, and a lot of times they celebrate it in a carnival-like atmosphere. There's a lot of dressing up, a lot of partying going on, and so there's been much controversy and dispute as to whether believers should celebrate in this minor holiday. It's not a feast of Yah, and it's not a commanded holiday, and it was an honor over a Jewish victory over an enemy. And so there are many theories or origins on Purim, but I haven't really found some of the definitive proof of any of those. So, and with that in mind, I'm not really going to look at the controversy on whether or not to celebrate the holiday. But like I said, I'm going to just really focus on the biblical aspect here and look at the book of Esther. Now, typically they read the whole book of Esther. I'm not going to go through the whole book, but Purim commemorates a time when the Jews, Yehudim, were living in Persia and were saved from extermination. And that was about 2,300 years ago. And it's actually celebrated for 2 days because the word Purim, Pur, means lot. And so Purim means lots, and it refers to the lots that Haman used to choose for the date of their massacre. And so today it's become, to be celebrated in a very festive way. They have costumes, masks. A lot of times there's all these noise makers that they call groggers. There's a lot of food, drink, and music. And, many have even called it a Jewish Halloween, so to speak. Um, One description by a friend said that it was like actually Halloween on steroids. Now, Purim is celebrated on the 14th and the 15th day of Adar, which is the Hebrew month, which usually falls between sometime in late February and even into mid March. So now you see that we're into March, and this is where it falls tomorrow night. Now, the 13th of Adar was the day that Haman chose for the extermination of the Jewish people, the Yudim, and the day that the Yudim battled their enemies for their lives. And on the day afterwards, which was the 14th day, they celebrated their survival. And where they were living in Persia was in a town called Shushan, which was actually a walled city. And so the book of Esther says that their deliverance was not complete until the next day. And therefore, the 15th day of the month of Adar is referred to as Shushan Purim because it wasn't until they made it into the walled cities that everything was complete and that they were truly saved. So that way, that's why it's a 2 day holiday. Now, since Jerusalem has both walled and unwalled parts, Purim is celebrated on both days. So if you have, cities who have walls, that it's usually you're going to have a 2 day holiday, just like in Jerusalem. Now, like I said, the main part of Purim is actually reading the book of Esther. And Esther was actually, we have to remember these ancient books really weren't books like we have today. They were scrolls. And so it's called the Megillah, or the scroll. And in the Megillah or the scroll, it details that the king of Persia was actually called Ahasuerus. And historically, we can see there's no Persian king named Ahasuerus. So then people really question, is this really a true story or not? And, with a little knowledge of Hebrew roots, and, we know that Hebraic people named um, their children or name things according to actions or deeds. And names hold a very important meaning in the Hebraic context. And so, just like Melchizedek, I believe, is not really a literal name, but it's actually Malchi, which is king, and Zedek means righteous. So, King Ahasuerus which which is translated and means I will be silent and poor. Um, but when you look at that word Ahashverosh in Hebrew, Ahash ve Rosh. Ahash is the term that's used to talk about a viceroy or someone who is governing a large empire in ancient times. Um, the ve in Hebrew means it's a conjunction meaning and Rosh means head. So loosely translated, Ahashverosh is actually the viceroy who is the leader or the head. And with that in mind, it's believed, historically that the king that's referred to as King Ahasuerus is actually King Xerxes. So historically lining up with what we have in the biblical account, it's believed to be King Xerxes. So if you read the book of Esther yourself, and like I said, I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I want to pull out some passages and, look at some verses that really stood out to me. So let's go to Esther chapter 2, verse 5. There was in Shushan, the capital, a man who was a Jew, a Yehudi, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shemi, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Okay, so we've got here who this person is talking about, Mordecai. And even if you're reading, in the Hebrew, it calls him a Jew. But then it goes on to describe who his father was and who his father was. And it also says he was a Benjamite. And remember in the tribe teachings that I'm doing, that I'd also pointed out, you can't really be a Yehudi and a Benjamite because Yehuda comes from Judah. And that means you're of the tribe of Judah. But a Benjamite means you're from the tribe of Benjamin. So you can't be from both tribes. And so what really is talking about Yehudi is really talking about when the kingdom had split. Remember that you have in the southern kingdom, that which ends up being Yehuda and Benjamin, that is the tribe that was the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, which was Ephraim, was already in exile during the time of Purim. Yet we still see a remnant of Ephraim that stayed in the southern part of Yehuda, or the southern kingdom of Yehuda. And so that's why he is referred to as both a Jew, a Yehuda, because he was from the house of Yehuda, but he was really from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, like I said, when we start going through this, we can see a little more that he is really a Benjamite. And then, the northern tribes, remember both houses of Israel during the time of exile, you have Yehuda and Ephraim living actually in Persia. And that is where the story of Esther is taking place. So we see Esther in chapter 2. Let's go to verse 7. And he had Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, because she had neither father nor mother, and the girl was shapely and good looking. And after her father and mother's death, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. So really in Babylon, remember Persia, when you're sitting here thinking, is controlled by this, Babylonian king, the Medo-Persian king, I guess you could say. But remember that ends up being, taking over the Babylonian Empire. That this name Esther means star. And the origin of her name actually traces back to Ishtar, which a Babylonian goddess. But remember in verse 7, at the beginning, it says he had raised Hadassah. Hadassah is her Hebrew name. So her Babylonian name is Esther, but Hadassah is her Hebrew name. And Hadassah means myrtle. And Hadassah's father was actually Ahil, which means my father is my strength. Now let's go over to chapter 3. Esther chapter 3 and verse 8. Then Haman said to Ahasuerus, there is a particular people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all of the provinces of your kingdom. So Haman, who's like the king's right hand person here is talking, and he says, there's this people that are scattered amongst your people all over your province, and their laws are different from those of every other people. Moreover, they don't observe the king's laws. It doesn't befit the king to tolerate them. So Haman acknowledges that there's this group of people and their laws are different than the others that are living in the land. And so the laws of the Israelites are different from those of the world. It's a lesson for us. Remember, we are to be set apart people. We're not to be like the rest of the world. And that's one of the underlying teachings within the story of Purim, is that we should be set apart and we should look different. Now, let's look at exactly who Haman is, because I think that comes to play very important here. If we look at Esther chapter 3, verse 1, it says, sometime later, King Ahasuerus began to single out Haman, the son of Hamdata, I guess let's say, the Agagite, for advancement. And eventually he gave him precedent over all of his fellow officers. So he's called an Agagite or Agagite. And if we go back to 1 Samuel, we get a little bit more details about who these people were. So the Agagite are named after King Agag. Okay, so in 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 8, he took Agag, the king of Amalek, alive, but he completely destroyed the people, putting them to the sword. So Haman, in the story of Esther, is actually the descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And so remember that Saul disobediently allowed them to live. And as a result of letting Agag live, the Jews, the Yehudi, had to deal with Haman in later times in the story of Esther. So also Yah had already spoken, that the people were going to have to battle Amalek from generation to generation. So really think about Haman is Amalek or was an Amalekite. So he was Amalek. And so this is a battle, even though physically he's not here today, but this is a battle that's still going on today between Yah's people and Amalek. Remember, it says we're going to keep fighting that spirit over and over and over again. In Exodus chapter 17 and verse 16, Exodus 17:16, it says, and because their hand was against the throne of Yah, Yah will fight Amalek generation after generation. And remember, he's fighting on our behalf there. So the enemy or the adversary is the one who really tries to exterminate and utterly destroy Yah's chosen. And we see this in the book of Esther. We see Haman, who is the descendant of Amalek, who is the enemy here. And he is actually going out, and he's referred to actually in the Hebrew 4 different times. Let's go to those verses in the book of Esther as the enemy or the adversary. In Esther chapter 3 and verse 10, Esther 3:10, and then the king took his ring from his hand and he gave it to Haman, the son of Hamdata, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. So here he's called an enemy. In chapter 8, Esther 8, verse 1, and on that day the king Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. So we here again have him referred to as an enemy. In Esther chapter 9, in verse 10, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamdata, the enemy of the Jews, slew they, but this on the spoil laid not their hand. So again, the enemy. Esther 9 and verse 24, because Haman, the son of Hamdata the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and he had cast lots or pour, that is a lot to consume them and to destroy them. So there are 4 times in the book of Esther that Haman is described as the enemy or the adversary. And that word, the enemy that is used in the Hebrew, has at its root zarar. And zarar means to bind or to be narrow or to be in distress or to besiege or to be bound or tied up or shut up or to be in dire straits. So when we think about what he's doing, all of those definitions really apply to Hasatan, Satan. And so when we look at the Hebrew meaning of Satan or Satan and its root, Satan in Hebrew means adversary or one who withstands or stands against. And if you look at the root of that, it is actually to be an adversary, to resist, or to oppose. And so this is also a picture of the anti-Messiah. So here we've got Haman, who is trying to destroy Yah's chosen people. And he is a picture of Hasatan here. He is Amalek. Okay, just like we said, the spirit that's fighting over and over again. And so history is cyclical. It's not a straight line. And this story unfolds again and again and again. And another interesting thing that I found here was talking about the timing. So let's go back to chapter 3 and verse 10, and I want to read a little bit more. In Esther chapter 3 and verse 10, it says, the king took his signet ring from his hand, and he gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you and to the people too, to do with as it seems good to you. And the king's secretaries were summoned on the 13th day of the first month. They wrote down all of Haman's orders, the king's army commanders and governors in all the provinces, and to all the officials of every people, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language. Everything was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. The letters were sent by courier to all of the royal provinces to destroy, kill, and exterminate all Jews, from young to old, including small children and women, on a specific day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to seize their goods and plunder. So today, right now, as I'm making this video, it is the 13th day of the month of Adar. Okay, so that was the day that historically that he sent these letters by these provinces to kill and exterminate and destroy all the Jews, from young to old, including small women and children. And so, like any plan of the enemy, he tries to copy some important event on Yah's calendar. You know, he's not that creative. He doesn't come up with these days off the top of his head. He has to copy something. And so the Sopharim, the scribes, wrote down Haman's plan to kill the Jews. And they sent out this order on the 13th day of the first month. But remember, on the 12th month is the day that it was going to happen. And this is very interesting because the first month is the month of Nisan or Aviv. And on the 14th day of the month is Pesach. So he sent out this notice on the first day, on the 13th day of the first month, which was the day before Pesach. And so that's when the enemy sent out this order to destroy Yah's people. And the people of Yah would have followed. Now think about this. They would have followed the mitzvahs, and they're sitting down for the Passover meal, and they're just now learning about this plan that the enemy has to destroy them. And remember that the first month is the remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt and their journey to the promised land. And so think about what a prophetic picture this is for the Jews who are now living in Shushan, in Persia. The adversary's plans were being thwarted. And, you know, as they're getting this notice that we're going to be annihilated, which just like what happened in Egypt, you know, this plan that they were going to be annihilated. And then here Yah saved them through the journey of the Exodus. Now we see this similar thing happening in Persia. Their deliverance all hinged upon obedience. And when Mordecai heard of Haman's plan, he put on his sackcloth, which represents repentance and mourning, and he fasted. In Esther chapter 4 and verse 16, it says, "Go assemble all the Jews to be found in Shushan and have them fast for me, neither eating nor drinking for 3 days and nights. And also I and the girls attending me will fast the same way. Then I will go into the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So this fast that Esther was going to do lasted for 3 days and nights. Now, hopefully, that 3 days and nights is seeming a little familiar to you. If we go to the book of Matthew, remember in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 40, Yeshua here is talking about this prophecy. It says, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the depths of the earth." So this fast would begin on the 15th of Aviv, which is the first day of unleavened bread, which was the same amount of time and the dates that Yeshua would have been in the tomb. So think about what was happening here, the parallel. In fact, all the Jews throughout the Medo-Persian Empire fasted, even Hadassah. And, this is a big lesson to learn here because they were all in unity and they all repented and were calling out to Yah. And so after this time, there was this great feast. And there would have been at the same time, if you think about this parallel, 3 days later was the Feast of First Fruits. And so there's this great feast, that parallel picture here. And you see that the adversary, the Amalek, should have been done away with a long time ago. But because Saul did not do that, he comes back around again. He comes back around again. And so within the book of Esther, it's always been said there's no mention of the name of Yah or Elohim in here. But Isaiah 45 and 15 says, "Truly you are a God who hides himself, a God of Israel, our Savior." And so when we look at this book, even though his name is not explicitly mentioned, Yah is hidden in here. He wants to reveal himself to his people. And actually, his name is hidden 4 times in the book of Esther that I found. His name can be found 2 times by using the initial letters. That means the first letters of words, 1 time forward and then 1 time backward. And then we can see that his name can be found using the final letters of words in the last letter, 1 time forward and 1 time backward. And so I'm going to show you those. So here are the verses with the Hebrews, with the Hebrew highlighted. And so I'm going to share my screen. Give me just a second so you can see my notes here. And I just want you to see this. Okay. So here in my notes, I just want you to see this. So this is Esther chapter 5, verse 4. It says, "And Esther answered, if it seem good to the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I prepared for him." So you can see that I have it written in Hebrew also, but you can see the initial letters forward. So in this phrase that's highlighted right here, "and let the king come this day," okay? "And let the king come this day" is what it says in Hebrew, okay? So, Ve'yavo Hamelech Ve Haman Hayom. Okay, so we've got that phrase in Hebrew. If you look at the first letter of those words, and it is actually written, highlighted in green. So, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. If we look at Esther chapter 1 and verse 20, and when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all of his empire, for it is great. All the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both great and small. Okay, so again, I have the verse written in Hebrew. This phrase is highlighted. All the wives shall give to their husbands honor. Okay, so this is the phrase in Hebrew. And then when you look at the initial letters, this time backwards. So did it forward. Now look at the initial letters backwards. So I'm going to start with the last word then because we're spelling Yah's name, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, or Hey, Vav, Hey, Yud. Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey backwards. So we have it in the first letter of those words, but he also hides his name in the last letters within the book of Esther. So if we go to Esther chapter 5 and verse 13, yet all this availeth me nothing. So as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So when you look at this verse, again, I highlighted in yellow this phrase, yet all this availeth me nothing. This is it in Hebrew. And if you look at the final letters backwards this time, so Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. Same thing in Esther 7:7. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went to the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make a request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. So when we look at that, I've got the verse here and then in Hebrew, and then that there was evil right here in Hebrew. And when you look at the final letters forward, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. So what I'm getting at here is even though we explicitly don't see Yah's name or Yah or Elohim mentioned here, those four verses have his name hidden within it. So when we look at here at the story of Esther, as well as, our walk with Yah, it's interesting that when you look at what those verses were and the phrases that I highlighted, wives must be subject to their husbands, and the husbands must sit in the gates of the king, learning Yah's word and wisdom. Be kind to your enemies, like Haman, and be hospitable to Yah's people. That's Esther 5:4. And at the end of time, Yah will destroy your enemies, Haman, and you will be with your king, Esther 7:7. So when you look at those four verses, Esther 1:20, Esther 5:13, Esther 5:4, and Esther 7:7, we get this picture of our walk with Yah. And that Yah is showing us that he's hidden in the midst of every situation. He wants to reveal himself to his people and to his bride. So here they are in the midst of their captivity, and now they're looking at being destroyed, but Yah is there in the midst with them. So hopefully that's giving you some comfort, no matter what you're going through, that Yah is there in the midst of that situation with you, and he wants to reveal himself to you and to his bride. He wants to reveal himself to his bride. So just keep searching after him. Now, in the Brit Hadashah, in the New Testament, we are commanded to help Yehuda. In Romans chapter 15 and verse 27, it says, they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the nations have shared in the Jews' spiritual blessing, they owe it to the Jews to share with them their material blessings. And here in this story, Hadassah has a choice. She has a choice to make, a choice to help or not. She is from the tribe of Benjamin. She's basically, part of the kingdom of the house of Yehuda, the southern kingdom. And Mordecai tells her that if you fail to speak out, that relief and deliverance will come, but from another direction. That Yah is going to save his people, but that she would not be a part of the plan and would die. And then the famous line that, her position was, acquired for such a time as this. That's in Esther 4:13 and 14. So if we think about, Hadassah or Esther, she was a Benjamite or an Israelite, using that bigger term for the house. And she was given the opportunity to come and help the relief of her brother Yehuda. Because technically she's not Yehuda, she is from the other house, the broader term of an Israelite. And she had the opportunity to come and help and bring relief to her brother, and to be a part of Yah's divine plan. And Ephraim, just like the house of Ephraim, has an important role today to play in the battle of the last days. And it's our choice whether we be like Hadassah, will we take a stand and be part of that plan? Now, an interesting link occurred in more current times, I would say, not necessarily current as our day, but it has occurred. And many believe there's a link between Purim and the events in World War II. In Esther chapter 9 and verse 13, then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews that are in Shushan to do tomorrow, also according to this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So, at the end of the story, we know, of course, Haman, is found out everything that happens. And the king is going, the queen says, okay, let his 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. Well, after World War II, we know what happened during the Holocaust, and Nazi war criminals were actually tried in Nuremberg, Germany. And if you have never seen about the Nuremberg trials, there's lots of movies on that and documentaries. But there were actually 10 Nazi war criminals that were hung for crimes against humanity that they committed. And they were, there was one among the 10 that was openly defiant and held to his Nazi beliefs, walking to his death. Julius Streicher, the Nazi editor of the anti-Semitic newspaper Das Strömer, yelled out "Hi Hitler," even walking to his death. Even as they put the noose around his neck, he proclaimed Purim Fest 1946. Even though these hangings did not take place during the time of Purim, Stryker was making a connection to the hanging of Haman's 10 sons to the hanging with the Nazi war criminals. Now, if you look at the book of Esther, where it mentions the names of Haman's 10 sons who were hung, you can see something interesting here. And, I'm going to show you in the Hebrew, there are some small letters in their names, and their names are written one over another. They're not written like as we write across a line, they're written one down the page. Okay, so as we're looking at this, and it starts in Esther chapter 9, verse 7, remember that in Hebrew, there are no such thing as capital letters or lowercase letters. So if you see on a Torah scroll bigger letters or smaller letters, it's pointing you to something important. And so what I want to show you here, I'm going to share again a picture of my notes. And I wanted to show you those starting in Esther chapter 9, verse 7. And you can see this is what it looks like on a Torah scroll. And you can see right here, there is a small letter, small letters. Okay. So there's written some small letters there. And that, like I said before, the sages have always taught that whether you see a small letter or a large letter, Yah is trying to point out something. And so I wanted you to see that how it's listed in Esther 9:7 through 9:9. The names are not written across, they're written one over the other. Okay. So as we're going through that, I want you to remember that. Now, when you look at that list of names, there were 4 actual letters that were written small. Okay, there was the Tav that was in the first name in verse 7. There was the Shin and a Tav in the 7th name. And then in the verse 9, you actually have a Zion, which is in the 10th name. So what's interesting here, so if you start at the top and you look down the line, 3 of the 4 letters are highlighted. And you remember in the Hebrew, letters can also represent numbers and dates. And so what's interesting, and this is why I said there's this link here, is when you look at these 4 letters, okay, that were written much smaller. And this was written on a Torah scroll thousands of years ago, okay? So we've got the Tav, which is 400 in Hebrew, the Shin, which is 300, the Zion, which is 7. So that's a total of 707. Okay. Now, by using the Jewish recording of years, the thousands of years are skipped. It's only the last part of the years that are written. So when they're referencing a year, 5707, they a lot of times they're leaving off the first part of it and they're just saying 707. Okay. So interestingly, the Nazi war criminals, when you look at history, the date they were hung was October the 16th, 1946. Now, you can go to the Hebrew Cal. It's www.hebcal.com, HebrewCalendar.com. The Hebrew date, if you put in October 16th, 1946, the Hebrew date would be the 21st of Tishri, 5707. That was the exact year that is referenced in those small letters. They're written small in the names of the 10 sons of Haman that were hung. And it's also interesting that that's the date that the hangings occurred, are in the year of 1946. Now it says that, it was the 21st day of Tishri. Well, we look at what is Tishri. Tishri is the seventh month on the Hebrew calendar. The 21st day is the last day of Sukkot, which in Hebrew is also called Hashanah Rabbah, or the Great Save Us. So think about what this story of Purim is about. It is the Great Save Us, that the day that not only we have their salvation, but centuries later, when we have 1946 happen and World War II, that these 10 Nazi war criminals were hung on the same date as the last day of Sukkot, which was the Great Save Us. And so for centuries, Jews have read the book of Esther and have had this future date for the fulfillment of for her prophecy there in plain sight. They didn't know. I mean, they've been reading Esther every Purim since they came back out of the captivity, but they didn't decipher the event until it actually occurred. It's like the hindsight's 2020. So I just wanted to share some of that information with you about Purim. And like I said, it's not going through about how you celebrate Purim, but just some historical links there. So hopefully you enjoyed this teaching on Purim, and maybe it gave you a little bit more insight and let you think about own things and applying it to yourself. So if you celebrate Purim, then tomorrow night, Purim Sameach.